You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. Today, we explore the multi-faceted legacy of Asian Americans. In recent months, as we know, they've increasingly become the targets of hate crimes. I have a couple of statistics from a think tank, courtesy of yesterday morning's paper. Across the country, in the last quarter, there's been a 164% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. New York, the worst at 223%, 140% in San Francisco, and 80% in Los Angeles. So it's very sobering. A range of other issues also come to mind. These are more background issues. Asian Americans in international study programs, as well as Asian nationals in study programs here. Charges of intellectual espionage and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Our special and welcome guest and my own very old good friend is the distinguished logician, Professor Gary Marr of State University of New York at Stony Brook. We begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Professor Marr, Gary, if we might, could you tell us a bit about your background You are from California, are you not?
Yes. Yes, I am. I was born in Richmond, California, and I was a colleague of Jim at Loyola Marymount while I was finishing my PhD at UCLA. There I met wonderful people like Rhonda Chervin and Bob Hurd, and especially Jim, who affected the way I wanted to be an academic. I ended up at Stony Brook, but I remember fondly those days at Loyola Marymount. Let's see, what was the question again, Jim?
Well, anything more about the background, just to give us a little context.
Well, I grew up in Sacramento. I learned a lot about, let's see, I think, first of all, that what's going on now is because of a lack of Asian American history in the public mind. And because Asians are missing from that history, they often feel as if they're eliminable. They're not really part of the American story. And part of what I had growing up is I didn't know that history, and I had to discover it just like a decade or two ago when I decided I needed to teach Asian American history. I had approached a donor, Charles Wang, after he had come back from China and after I'd just come back from China with the Society of Christian Philosophers, and I felt that there was a need to know this history. Two Asian American girls at a local high school had committed suicide on the Long Island Railroad, Ellen Liu and Millie Sabuti. And they had met in the Gifted and Talented program in third grade. And my oldest daughter was just about to go into that program. And I thought, that it couldn't be just an accident that these two Asian American girls had made this suicide pact. And I wanted the university to be a place where these issues can be talked about and discussed. And so that's how I got involved. I approached a donor, Charles Wang, to just modify a hallway. It was just this hallway that wasn't being used. I asked my dad, who was a World War II veteran, to draw the plans for that. And he drew it. I submitted it to Charles, and he decided to donate the money for the hallway, but also $25 million to build an Asian American center on my campus. And at the time, it was the largest donation in the history of public education in New York. And so there was no education. So I said, well, I have to learn this. I have to start teaching myself. And I advocated for it to be recognized to the American Philosophical Association, and that was successful. And so I just ended up teaching it for a decade or two and learning it and teaching my students about that history.
Okay, Mario, you want to take us forward? We got a good context already.
Yes, it's very interesting. I'm curious about what you said, that the history of Asian American is missing. There is no narrative, or it seems there is no narrative that can explain where your people are coming from. To what factor you attribute that situation?
Well, it's due to several things. It's the stereotype of Asians as always being foreigners. No matter how long you've been here, I'm third generation, you're still not considered truly American. And there's also the perception, because of the way the history is taught, that Asian Americans are silent, resigned victims. If you look at the pictures in history books, the most famous ones are either the Transcontinental Railroad meeting, and it says, not an Asian face is to be seen, even though Chinese were 90% of the workforce coming from California. But the famous photo is just saying they're absent. Another picture that you'll find in history books is a Japanese child sitting on a suitcase looking forlorn, and people being herded into trains. 110,000 Japanese Americans were put into these detention camps, concentration camps in 10 deserted parts of the United States. 2/3 of them were American citizens, and the other third were forbidden to become American citizens by discriminatory laws. And yet the 442nd, which is the most decorated battalion of its kind in military history, the all-Japanese American force that fought in the European theater because they weren't trusted to fight in the Pacific theater, were sacrificing their lives at a rate that was phenomenal. And the amount of decorations they obtained is still historic to this day. But yet they were doing this while their wives and their families were in the internment camps. Asian Americans are often afraid to say concentration camps, but that's what they were. They're afraid to say that because they don't want it to be compared to the death camps, which Jewish people were subjected to in Europe at the time. But it was a horrible part of American history, and it's still there, even though eventually the government apologized for this. The legal precedent is still there. Judge Roberts wrote the dissenting opinion and said it's still there like a loaded gun that can be used to detain people in times of crisis. And that's what we've seen after 9/11. After 9/11, the hate crimes went up not just 200%, it went up 1,600% against people that looked like Muslim or Arab or West Asian. The conditions are there because at times of economic hardship, people need a scapegoat, and they scapegoat Asian Americans because they're characterized as model minorities, right? Model minorities for whom? The stereotype came about in the 60s to discipline the civil rights movement. So if you're a model minority, you're a minority and you're a model, but model for whom, right? It was saying that here are people that pull themselves up by their bootstraps because of their cultural values, and people who are demonstrating in the street for civil rights should not be so violent and follow these model minorities. But, that history is not true. First of all, many Asian Americans are in the poverty level, people from Southeast Asia and so forth. They don't use federal services. Also, being stuck as a model minority means that you get violence from not only whites, the dominant group, but also from minorities who resent being held up to a model. I had the privilege of interviewing Yuri Kochiyama while I was doing this teaching. Yuri is pictured in the famous photo, Time Life photo with Malcolm X. She was in an internment camp during World War II. She was a journalist. Her husband was in the 442nd. And then after she got out, she arranged for Hiroshima maidens to come back to America to get plastic surgery on their faces with Jewish doctors. And then she moved her family to work in Harlem with Malcolm X. And when I went out to interview Yuri, she was there in her walker. She was living in a black retirement home in Oakland, and she was still getting calls to go to rallies. And I have one of the few interviews where she talks about how Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were coming together in their philosophies. She said Malcolm saw that King was able to get great crowds, and Martin Luther King was starting to see that Malcolm's analysis of what was going on was deeper than just talking about civil rights. Martin Luther King was starting to criticize the Vietnam War because a great percentage of the people who were dying were African American men. And when he was told not to talk about that, he said, I fought against segregation so long I can't segregate my conscience. And he, both of them were assassinated along with Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. I've worked with activists who knew these people, and what Yuri said to my students, she said, learn history and change the world. There's a beautiful documentary made about her by one of the mothers of the civil rights workers who were killed in the South. The Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. Goodman's mother financed a documentary called Yuri Kochiyama, Passion for Justice. But I felt privileged to go out there and interview her. Before
you've been emphasizing history, and Christopher writes history texts, so I want him to come into this conversation.
Okay. I don't know if this is more of a question or observation, but it's something you can comment on. Something you said, we were talking about earlier, about how that in a sense that people don't seem to understand the whole idea of the model minority. A Mexican fellow, a friend of mine from Yucatan years ago, said to me, he said, one of the problems that he thought was a problem with relations with Mexicans was that some people tended to think that Mexicans were more virtuous than whites. And therefore they kind of put up this ideal. He says, we're just as human as everybody else. There are good Mexicans and there are bad Mexicans. And he wanted that to be acknowledged. Two, I was thinking, my wife's mother is from the Philippines. And when I first started dating my wife, we would go out in different places. And she was able, for me, coming from my middle Western family background, people from the Asians pretty much looked the same. But my wife was pointing out the difference. She said, no, that person's Chinese, that person's Japanese, that person's Indonesian, that type of thing. I wonder to what extent is that lack of understanding of, is it a lack of a full grasp of the actual humanity of people who are just different from us, both in the fact that they can be evil even, or that there really are differences amongst Asians, which are as profound as the differences that you will find, say, between Europeans.
Yes, I agree that all groups are just as human as other groups and have good and bad. But the way stereotyping works, in my opinion, is that there is a good stereotype and a bad stereotype, and people are not allowed to be in their full humanity in between. So if you are in a faculty meeting and you are supposed to be as quiet and a model minority, but you speak up and you object to something, all of a sudden you're put into the category of the angry Asian person or the bad Asian person. And that's how stereotypes work for people of the generation my parents grew up. There was Charlie Chan, who was the model minority, and Fu Manchu. And you had to be one or the other. As soon as you act up, you're put in the bad category. Same thing for women. Anna May Wong played both the Dragon Lady and the Lotus Blossom, right? So one stereotype is the woman who can, who knows, has a lure, and is able to seduce men. And the evil version was the version that drew men into their into depravity, right? But the way it works is that you don't become human. You're not in between, because we don't have the stories of real people. We have these stereotyped polar opposites, which are mechanisms of control rather than ways of giving humanity to these stories. Can I show you a picture?
Sure.
Okay, so let me tell you an example of a story here that has been helpful when I have. This is a picture of my dad. He was a veteran during World War II, because my grandfather was the informal mayor of Modesto, California, of the Chinatown. And so my dad, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, he wanted to join the Air Force, and he had my grandfather, who couldn't speak or read English, sign the form so he could go. And at the same time, he saw his Japanese American kids, going off to internment camps. But this is what he was most proud of. It says, on the 25th day of October 1944, the fickle finger of fate finds it expedient to trace on the roll of the Lucky Bastards Club the name of John W. Marr, bombardier on the Flying Fortress Little 8-Ball, for having this day achieved the remarkable record of sailing forth and returning no less than 35 times, for having braved the hazards of Hun flak, for bringing to Hitler and his cronies tons of bombs, for bending the Luftwaffe back, all through the courtesy of the 8th Air Force, who sponsor these programs in the interests of liberty-loving people everywhere. And on the back, are the signatures of the people on his plane. Well, you see, my dad was he was stationed in Big Springs, Texas, where he met my mom, who was cleaning carburetors and putting them in cars. And he went overseas, and 35 missions was 10 more than the standard tour of duty that was 25. People were dying at the rate of 25% of the planes never came back. Some people say Jimmy Stewart's performance in It's a Wonderful Life is so powerful because he was sent for 2 missions on the front lines in an airplane like this, and he's suffering PTSD. But my dad flew 35 missions, and then when he came back, they got married. They started the first Chinese takeout place in Sacramento. He used his his engineering skills. He took out the back seat of the delivery truck and put a pan of water over it, and the steam heated the chow mein, and all of this they started that, and all my mother's family, their younger brothers and sisters, came to live with them there. You see, because when my mother was a teenager, her father was the head of a Chinese association, but he was murdered, and she was forced to raise her younger brothers and sisters with her older brother. So Joseph, and she was Mary, had to raise these kids because their mom was put in an institution because the dominant society didn't understand that it was normal for Chinese women to talk to the ghosts of their departed spouse. Much like Catholics would pray to saints for guidance. And so when her mother was institutionalized, she had to raise these kids. And so that's why she was putting carburetors in. And then they all moved to Sacramento and lived there. They had Southern names like Annabelle Lee and Olive and Willie Mae. And all the Chinese guys in Sacramento would cruise by the Chinese kitchen because these Southern belles had come into town. And it was a cool thing to be a delivery boy for this. And so my dad, though, because he bombed all these buildings, he went back to Berkeley on the GI Bill and became an architect. And, if he hadn't been able to do that, I probably would never have gone to college and been a professor. But because he did that, he when I told Dad after he retired, come back and draw plans for a remodeling of a hallway, he did that. And he put Charles Wang's name on it, and I gave those plans to Charles. And when he came to speak at Stony Brook, and he had just come back from China, like I had just gone with the Society of Christian, and his heart was changed. And for somehow he just looked at it, and his wife said, "Charles, why don't you do it?" And he reached out his hand, and he gave me a check for $25,000 to refurbish this hallway. And on the way out of the door, he said, why are we doing a hallway? Why don't we do a building? And that's how it led to the $25 million by the end of the year. But
that's extraordinary, Gary. That's just really extraordinary. And I can tell how you've come to be an activist while making your mark initially and continuously as an academic. And in a way, you had an earlier model for this blend of the academic and the activist with Donald Kalish at UCLA. Isn't that right?
Yeah, Donald Kalish was my mentor. He hired Angela Davis. He was at the Chicago 7 trial. And I always admired Don because he was a great teacher. He let people, become his students become important, like David Kaplan and other philosophers, Dana Scott. There's so many people that became famous logicians because of Kalish. But Kalish was that generous kind of person. He invited me to author the second edition of that classic textbook because, he had put off becoming a full professor, and that was his way of doing it. But he was very generous in that way, and that's the kind of academic I wanted to become. I wanted to be the kind of person who was a good teacher.
I want to make one more comment before going back to Mario and perhaps going ahead to other questions relating to Asian Americans. And the comment is this. We've had a number of good friends and, wonderful people on this program. Just last week, we had, I think, a terrific education in the development of Christian democracy in Italy. So we're kind of far-ranging. But the person I was thinking of, and here's a connection to Hollywood, and here's a connection to stereotyping. There's a fellow named Ron Austin, and he's still with us, very much with us, and he is the last living member of the Hollywood blacklist. Once upon a time, there was a fellow named McCarthy, and there was a blacklist, and Ron Austin was on it, and because he was on it, he had a transition from Hollywood to Catholic Charities work. It's quite a transition. I'm not going to ramble forever. One of the things that Ron says is, even more so in the past, Hollywood and television, almost nothing to do with art, almost nothing. Everything is prepackaged. Everything that's produced is understood as a commodity. And if what you're producing is a commodity, you pretty much shape the subtext for it. And so I suspect that what's going to happen is, perhaps what's already happening is, we go from one group of people shaping one kind of commodity to another group of people shaping another kind of commodity. And what gets lost in the transition, it was lost before the transition, is art. Let the story be the story. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that we have to at least note. Now, Mario, we've got a number of other questions that we want to ask Gary. I wonder if you would like to lead us into one or other.
Yes, I was very careful listening to your story. Let me tell you a brief background. When I came to this country 30-some years ago, I wanted to study philosophy, speculative philosophy, mainly metaphysics. And I went to a professor who was a very prestigious professor then, who was the only Hispanic. And probably at that time, there were not many Hispanic at the American Philosophical Association. I think he was one of the very few. And he interviewed me. We spoke in Spanish, and he said, well, it's better for you to study other than speculative philosophy, something about your background. And you need to get first legitimacy by showing that the continent from which you belong or you coming from has also a philosophy. And he mentioned, I remember vividly, the expression in 1941, 42, I think Jean-Paul Sartre said, well, today Paris and France fell. The Nazi has just destroyed our country. And France believed to be the center of humanity what is human. So we no longer have a awareness of what is human now, because the barbarian has just destroyed our country. And he said, that professor said, that was the starting point in Latin America of many to begin thinking about their own philosophy and not being copied from the French and from the Europeans. Mm-hmm. And he said, you need to start thinking about that. Otherwise, you are not going to have any legitimacy in the academic world in this country. So that, in many ways, changed what I was been doing. Now, when I hear, that's my point, that you are a logician, which to me is something that somehow is divorced from history, from something which is more practical, philosophically speaking. And you are not, quote unquote, an expert on Asian American philosophy, Asian philosophy. How did you become a logician? Which seems to me that's kind of divorced from anyone ethnicity, if you will.
Okay. A good question. I became interested in logic and philosophy in fourth grade when I was reading Martin Gardner's columns and books. And that sort of was magical to me about how you could solve puzzles and paradoxes. And Martin Gardner put a great deal of philosophy into it too. And many mathematicians and logicians had their start reading Martin Gardner's columns. You know, he took philosophy classes at the University of Chicago from Rudolf Carnap and wrote one of the few popular accounts of Carnap's philosophy. So that I grew up wanting that, and along the way, I experienced a lot of things that didn't make sense to me as an academic, why I was being treated differently, but they made sense once I started to understand Asian American history. So let me distinguish between Asian American studies and Asian studies. You can ask the question, can you understand the civil rights movement in America or the experience of blacks in America by studying the cultures of Africa? And the answer, of course, is no. And similarly, you can't understand the Asian American experience by studying the cultures of Asia. And so there's been sort of historically a distinction between two disciplines, Asian studies and Asian American studies, which I think are coming together these days with the critique of Orientalism in Asian studies and so forth. But originally they had two different agendas. Asian studies came out of the Cold War attempt to wanting to contain Asia after 1949 and Mao Zedong had come to power. So my dad was able to join the Air Force and so forth because China was considered to be the good guys and the Japanese were the bad guys, right? They had these famous Time Life magazine articles and how to tell your friends from the Japs. And they were very stereotypical. They would say that the Japanese were hard-heeled and so forth and laugh inappropriately, but the Chinese shuffle and are not as are more humorous and so forth. And this had nothing to do with the distinction between Chinese and Japanese. I mean, I always wondered growing up, why do people say, are you Chinese or Japanese? And you'd answer the question, and they couldn't tell anyway. But why would they keep asking? Well, it was because of World War II. You know, the Japanese were the bad guys, Chinese were the good guys, and they looked the same to people, right? But in 1949, all of a sudden it flipped. Chinese were the bad guys and Japan were the good guys. And you started to have movies like Tea House of the August Moon and these, making, the Japanese or the Koreans or whatever, the good guys and the Chinese the bad guys. And then, it keeps flipping like this, even though people can't tell the difference. So it tells you that the purpose of stereotypes is to control a group. So, a lot of anti-Asian hate now is because of the discourse about China, Chinese spies and so forth, that it's our greatest economic partner, competitor. And so people treat Asians in America as what American foreign policy is to the countries of Asia. Most of the wars in the 20th century have been against Asia. It began not only with the conquest of the Philippines, the first Vietnam, the takeover of Hawaii, the going around the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of these wars going around the Pacific Basin are an extension of the manifest destiny that the U.S. Felt it was its moral imperative, right? But manifest destiny sort of going around the Pacific Rim. And even today, when we see the conflict in West Asia, it's sort of that same colonial movement. American history really can't be understood outside of the fact that, Columbus didn't just, sail out of the blue in 1492. He was looking for China. He was looking for a route to China. And the Northwest Passage was an attempt to find a shortcut to China. So this idea of China being a place where you could get Oriental goods and spices and teas, and it was a place for wealth. This was part of the discovery of America. And today, the same thing. People look at China and Hong Kong, all that kind of stuff as economic opportunity. The turnover of Hong Kong in 1997 was very important to the Chinese people, but in America it was sort of like, why is this important? Well, the Boston Tea Party in America was throwing tea over. It was tea from China because the U.S. and Great Britain had introduced opium into China and addicted people to fix the trade imbalance. And as a result of that, there was a commissioner in China that burnt up the opium in protest. That was the context for the Opium Wars, and that's why Hong Kong and the other treaty ports were taken over with extraterritoriality. The British controlled that entry point into China. And so finally, when it was returned, it was a big deal around the world for Asian people. But in America, people didn't understand, wait a minute, that's connected to the Boston Tea Party. This is connected to American history. America had unfair treaties with China. So when I went with the Society of Christian Philosophers to China to talk about sharing Western philosophy and, philosophy of religion, I felt that it was important to talk about the healing of nations. And it was important to talk about, in the book of Revelation, it says that the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. In Genesis, you have the tree, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in the end, in Revelation, you have this other tree. And part of the healing of nations comes when nations admit what they have done to other nations. So I showed a documentary my students had made about Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, where Chinese were put into prison, and the scholars carved on the walls poems in Chinese about their imprisonment. People from their villages would spend all this money to send a representative, and only the best and most qualified scholars were often there representing their whole village, and yet they were detained on Angel Island because of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and they had to pass all of these interrogations about their villages, like how many windows was the house 2 doors down from you, and how many steps were there to your front room, and who was the person who lived on the next block. And of course, what the Chinese did was that they made up imaginary villages so they could answer these questions. And so they were accused of being tricky, but in fact, these discriminatory laws lasted for about 100 years in America. It wasn't until the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act that this was turned around. My dad fought in World War II. The United States passed the Magnuson Act to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it only raised the quota from 100 Chinese per year to 105 per year. That was the repeal, adding 5 more Chinese from anywhere in the world compared to 65,000 from Great Britain. So it wasn't until the Hart-Celler Act was passed during the Johnson administration that Asian countries were put on an equal footing with other countries. That's why you see the sudden growth of Asian Americans in this country after 1965. My uncle, Uncle Joe, who didn't move to Sacramento and live in the Chinese kitchen, was a bachelor in San Francisco. The ratio of men to women, because of discrimination laws against Chinese women going back to the Page Act in 1875, was like 20-1. It was 1,000-1 in the Old West. And so what people did was, there weren't enough women to marry. And so he extended his citizenship because there was a young single Chinese woman and her son that was going to be deported. So they married so that she can have his citizenship. And those were called paper sons and daughters, or these arranged marriages that the 1906 San Francisco earthquake destroyed the record, so people could claim to be sons and daughters of people who lived in the United States, and therefore they could become citizens. But he did this, and this is what Chinese did, and so they were called tricky, but even though they were just using their intelligence to fight discriminatory laws. He ended up committing suicide. His body wasn't discovered for a week later, but he believed in philosophy and reading, and he gave me, as part of my inheritance, $50 so I could buy any book I wanted. And that's how I bought Martin Gardner's book on mathematical logic. And, my own research finally came around where it was published in a descendant of Martin Gardner's column by Ian Stewart. It was using computers to, generate a chaotic version of the liar paradox. So I guess sort of a long question. I became a logician because of my first love. I learned about my history because of the need to protect my daughters. And then after all this happened, my Aunt Catherine told me that my grandfather was a philosopher. And when I got his notebooks and had them translated, he was a philosopher who was interested in mathematical puzzles. And here I thought I was going away from everything I grew up to be something totally different. And yet it comes around that I ended up learning about myself by following what I thought was a completely independent path.
Thank you.
G.K. Chesterton talks a lot about coming home.
Yeah.
Going around the world and coming home.
Yeah.
And how important that is. Christopher, we've got more history in front of us now. What next?
Yeah, I'm curious to return to the question that we started with, or the topic we started with, of hate crimes. I think most people would think, oh well, there was the Japanese internment camps in World War II, but really since that time there hasn't been overt acts of racism, or in this case hate crimes against Asian Americans. They might not know, like for instance, the struggles like the Filipino workers had to go through in the 60s and the like, and the bigotry they had to face. Are these hate crimes a new eruption, or you look upon them as maybe just intensification of something that has been continuous in America since, say,
it's certainly been continuous. It's just in the news now. But the structures of history that obliterate the history of a people are the same forces that allow these hate crimes to continue. The way I like to look at it is that they often, in the textbooks, say, well, what are the contributions of this group? And they always name, like in my university, Xian Yang was the Nobel Prize winner, or David Ho, who discovered cure for AIDS or the cause for AIDS, and they just list these people. But I think that's a wrong story, because it makes the Chinese were only important because they contributed to create the Transcontinental Railroad, which made America a country from sea to shining sea. But it's not right. The reason is that this is how I look at it. Imagine a white light, and you put it through a prism, a critical prism. What you see is a whole rainbow of colors. If you look back at American history through a critical prism of race and ethnicity and gender and so forth, you see it was always multicultural. It's not just something that was discovered recently. And instead, it's not just your contributions to the mainstream. It's actually the struggles of ordinary people that created that history, not just the people that are acknowledged. For example, the Q ordinance in San Francisco was the Chinese were cutting off their Qs, and they sued the person who was enacting this law, and they pooled all their money together to fight it legally. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was heard by Justice Fields, was a famous justice. And what he ruled was that it was illegal for this Q ordinance to be put in effect because it was targeting a group of people in a discriminatory way. And what happened was that the 14th Amendment was made to apply not only to citizens, but to anyone residing in America. And it was brought forth by these Chinese workers who pooled their money to fight this collectively. And they're not given, a part of history. They're not acknowledged. But these kinds of things are important. It's people on the margins of society, not those in the mainstream, who have struggled for their human rights and for their civil rights, that has made America a more democratic place for everyone. And that's why I look at the margins, the marginalized histories, knowing that Latin American history, knowing the Chinese American history, knowing the Asian American history, knowing Italian American history, that you can see how the story that we've gotten is not the right one. It's not just people contributing to the white dominant narrative. It's really all people in America, because of a kind of a melting pot and a place of welcoming immigrants. You're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to be free, that America became a more free and democratic place. And it didn't happen without a lot of blood and a lot of struggle.
Let me turn our direction a bit, although, Gary, I'm turning the direction prompted by something that you said not so long ago. Revelation, Book of Revelation, and the tree as it appears there. We can all be Marxists if we decide to look at everything in terms of class struggle. And we can be, all of us, critical race theorists if we look at everything through the struggle among the races. But what we want to be are followers of Jesus Christ. That's what we want to be, first and foremost. And we believe that Jesus Christ founded a church. And what we found is, in the life of that church, nations have oftentimes tried to take over the church for themselves. It's one of the oldest stories in the history of the church. And we find that Christians have often been willing to compromise with the nations in which they found themselves. And of course, that's part and parcel of our origin in Judaism, where the Jews oftentimes tied to compromise with the nations around them in ways that went against God's law. And here in the United States, we could say that I'm being very, very, very broad brush. I can't imagine a broader brush. But here in the United States, Christians have become properly bourgeois in order to conform to the ethos of a capitalist society. And now we have, and of course this is just manifestation 9027, now we have the idea that in China, the church is just okay so long as it's Chinified, sinicization. And here in the United States, we have pretty much the response, well, all right, whatever, just so long as we can maintain a profitable trade balance. So we look at China in terms of economics, and China looks at the church in terms of Chinese state power. And to put it in a very, very broad term and to add an element of modest humor to it. Here on this show, we mostly believe in rum, Rome, and rebellion. Now, if you believe in rum, Rome, and rebellion, and I certainly do, how would you assess what's going on in China under the direction not of the virtue, but under the direction of the centralization of power, pure and simple?
Well, of course, I can't speak for what's going on in China today. When I went back in 1995 with the Society of Christian Philosophers, I had to teach myself about Chinese history, and I wanted to give a piece that would, speak about the gospel in China. And so I struggled very hard. I was in Port Jefferson. I stumbled into a bookstore and I found a book of Christian art done by Asian artists from all over the world. And I said, okay, this is what I'm going to use. I'll use these images because they'll get past the translators. And I also wanted to address the issue of Tiananmen Square without doing it directly, because that would be against all of the delicacies of the politics. But I wanted to address that issue, so I looked at Paul's address to the philosophers in the Areopagus and Mars Hill, and what he did was he talked about the unknown God. Right, he saw all of these, religious relativism, all these gods. I mean, so here's this unknown God, and if you go back into Diogenes Laertes, it turns out this unknown God, goes back even to Epimenides. Epimenides, oftentimes logicians like to quote, the book of Timothy, where it's Epimenides, one of the Cretans, one of their own, lazy, and so forth, but they said all Cretans are liars, right? Well, it turns out Epimenides had talked about this unknown God. And so what I thought was that in every culture, there was a seed that God planted so for the gospel to grow. And the key for me going to China was to find what that was. And for me, it was Tiananmen. It's the gate of heavenly peace. And so what I wanted to say in my talk was that the seed that had been planted in China, this Tiananmen, which was the gate to the forbidden city where the ancient emperors lived, and also the square at which the pro-democracy movement took place, could be this counterpart to the unknown God. Tiananmen means gate of heavenly peace. Tian is heaven, and all of these events happened here, just like in Jacob's ladder in the Old Testament. This way to heaven, and I thought I could declare what the true meaning of the gate of heavenly peace is, because Jesus is our peace. The gate to heaven is Jacob's ladder in the Old Testament, and that the true meaning of the gate of heavenly peace is given in Christ. And so I went there sort of naive at the time. I threw a bunch of books into my suitcase. We weren't supposed to bring Bibles because that was illegal, but I threw some John Stott books in there. I threw The Cost of Discipleship, and so when I went there, I found that some of the scholars that we were talking to were very interested in Christian philosophy. The state was interested because they thought Christianity led to the Protestantism, which led to capitalism, which led to productivity and so forth. But some of these scholars were truly interested in Dietrich Bonhoeffer and so forth. And so when I was there, I wrote my name in Chinese and put it out there. And I was trying to make a statement, and one of the scholars was a Bonhoeffer scholar, and I said, look, back in my hotel room, I have a copy of The Cost of Discipleship. I brought it. You can give it to one of your students. And he followed me all the way back to my hotel room, and I handed to him this book with a green cover, and he began to weep because he had never held a copy of that book. And this was his passion for scholarship. And because of the censorship. They wouldn't let him have these books. And I think what had happened in China, there's the state-sponsored church, the Three Self Church, Three Self Patriotic Church, and then there's the official versions, but there's also the underground church. And so, I didn't know much about it. I gave my talk, and the students rushed up to the translator, and they said, "What must I do to be saved?" Because of these pictures by Asian artists. And Enoch Wan, who was our translator, I was sharing rooms with him, and he told me that he had started the first Bible studies at Stony Brook, where my university was. And I had met him just accidentally because I switched rooms with a theologian who didn't want to share rooms with him. And I said, of course, I'll share rooms with him. And what happened was the underground church contacted him. He had been trying to reach them for 12 years. And we went on this, from place to place. And finally, we met with some people in the underground church. And I asked, I opened up their hymnal, right? And one of the things is, one of my daughters, after my wife lost her first child, there was a man named John Wimber who prayed for my daughter to be born. And when I opened that thing up, the songs they had, there was John Wimber's Spirit song. And so I gave them all my equipment that I had smuggled in so I could show the slides and all this sort of thing. And I said, what can I do for you? And they said, just pray for us. And I said, will you pray for America? Because I feel that your faith is so much stronger. And they agreed to pray. And that's when I came back to the U.S. after that. And I saw Charles Wang had gone to China. And I had my dad draw the plans and I submitted it. And all of this stuff happened. And I kind of attribute it to the sincerity of the believers in China. Enoch went back, sponsored by a church I was attending, to train people to learn how to do their own Bible studies, because they had been just listening to Christian radio. When the missionaries got kicked out of China, that's when the indigenous form of Christianity took root in China. And he taught them how to go to the scriptures and give their own lessons, not just memorize what these radio preachers had said. And these people said, now we could go home for the first time. And he would tell stories. They would be locked up in a house at 4 a.m, and they would pray with their arms on the wall, so that when they would fall asleep, their head would hit the wall, and they would keep praying. And I think we could learn a lot. When you say, what the Great Commission in Matthew is pantata ethne, is to go to all people groups. It's translated nations, but ethne is the word. And it means that, people groups, you need to give the gospel in their heart language, so when it takes root, we learn more about the gospel because we've followed the Great Commission. It wasn't that, the Society of Christian Philosophers knew what all Christianity was about and just had to be transplanted into China, but I thought we had so much to learn from them. That it's not just about acting against your conscience or guilt. There was the removal of shame, that the Chinese was an important part of losing face. It was part of knowing solidarity in sin, rather than individuals having, just confess their faith to, say a sinner's prayer. But the community as a whole, suffering in sin because of what their forefathers had done, and learning to be healed in groups. And that's why I think the gospel begins with the tree in Genesis and ends with the tree of life in Revelations, because it's all the people groups that need us to teach us the fullness of the gospel that Jesus came to give us.
Thank you, Gary, for that extraordinary account. We are at the end of our program, and as you know, we always end with the gospel for today, which is a short gospel. It's from John. Jesus said to his disciples, "As the Father loves me, so I also love you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy might be in you and your joy might be complete. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thanks so much, Gary. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's been great to connect with you after all these years.
Well, what's it been? 4 or 5?
My first article published with you.
I thought getting old would take longer.
Well, let it take a little longer for all of us.
All right. Godspeed.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
Gary. Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.